pay attention to the girl in this video. On January 26, 2017, Cleveland police began retracing the steps of 14-year-old Aliana DeFries, last seen waiting for her bus to school. She has minutes left to live, because a man with a shaved head, broad-shouldered and silent, is already there, waiting, pacing the same frozen stretch of sidewalk again and again in the pre-dawn darkness of a Cleveland winter morning. Like someone who has done this before. Like someone who has chosen his prey. On this day, Aliana DeFries is simply trying to get to school. On this day, this man has one intention: to make sure she never arrives. What unfolds in the next moments will lead investigators to a crime so horrifying they will never forget it. On the morning of Thursday, January 26th, 2017, Denisha helped Aliana get ready for school. Just like every other school day, Aliana packed her backpack, pulled on her black coat, and wrapped her blue headscarf neatly around her head. The morning was bitterly cold, snow already threatening the Cleveland sky, but Aliana was not deterred. She took the RTA bus to school every single day. This was her routine. This was normal. Denisha watched her daughter board the bus and disappear down the street. She had no reason to worry. Aliana had done this hundreds of times. But this morning was different. By the time Denisha expected her daughter to be walking through a classroom door, she had vanished. No call from the school, no message from Aliana, nothing. When the afternoon came and Aliana still had not returned home, Denisha reached out to Watona, hoping against hope that there had been some confusion, some mix-up, some simple explanation. There was none. Panic set in immediately. Denisha hung up the phone and dialed 911.
For the 911 dispatcher, Mohammed, any please fire ambulance. I just want to report a missing child. How old is the child? Report patient.
She never made it to school this morning at all? No. Has she done this before? No. She's never ran away before or did it? You know, nothing like this before? No. Okay. Here's on over to you now. Okay. Bye-bye.
With a juvenile missing person case, investigators knew that time was the most critical factor of all. Every minute that passed without information was a minute that pushed the odds further in the wrong direction. A detective immediately contacted Aliana's school and spoke with the principal, who confirmed what the family already knew. Aliana was one of the most punctual, reliable students on the roster. Her sudden disappearance did not match her character in any way. This was not a runaway situation. This was something else. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood, checking fast food places, alleyways, familiar corners where local kids gathered after school. They swept through hangout spots, scanned storefronts, knocked on doors. As daylight faded and temperatures dropped toward freezing, the urgency intensified. More officers were called in to search abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and every location a young girl could hide or be hidden. Snow began to fall, adding another layer of dread to an already desperate night. As time goes on, there is a larger chance that something is wrong, that they were hurt, or injured, or kidnapped, or worse. Refusing to sit and wait, Aliana's family mobilized. Friends, relatives, neighbors all hit the streets together, covering every block they could reach and plastering the neighborhood with missing posters bearing Aliana's face. They searched relentlessly, driven forward by a terror that none of them were willing to name out loud. By 7 that evening, more than 12 hours had passed since anyone had last seen her. Night had set in fully, and the temperature had dropped towards zero. The thought of Aliana somewhere out in that freezing January cold, alone and unprotected, had become unbearable. Back at the station, investigators attempted to trace Aliana's phone. It had been switched off since the previous day. They went through her call logs, her messages, her social media activity. Nothing suggested she had planned to disappear. No secret conversations, no signs of a secret meeting, no indication that anything unusual had been happening in her life. Hospitals were contacted. No unidentified patient matched her description. With no immediate progress, investigators returned to the only thing they had left: the last confirmed sighting. When you are looking for a missing person and you have no success right off the bat, you go back to square one. And square one meant the bus.
Police are saying that Aliana DeFries was last seen getting off of a bus near 93rd and Kinsman Thursday morning, but since then, no signs of her.
Since Aliana took 2 buses every morning to reach her school, Detectives requested surveillance footage from both routes. By the next morning, more than 24 hours after she had vanished, the first recording became available. They cued the timestamp to approximately 6 in the morning. The time her mother had said she boarded, the footage showed a girl in a blue headscarf, black coat, and school uniform stepping onto the bus. It matched Aliana's description precisely. When the bus lights briefly illuminated the interior and the girl turned toward the camera, detectives were able to positively identify her. Up to that moment, she appeared calm and completely unharmed. At 6 in the morning, the bus stopped again and a young male boarded. He exchanged a few words with Aliana, and the two sat together, smiling, laughing, seemingly at ease with each other. To anyone watching, it looked harmless. Maybe she had a boyfriend. Maybe they had gotten off together and skipped school. There were no signs of distress, and investigators were forced to consider the possibility that she may have willingly left her route with someone she knew. But as the bus rolled further down the street, the story shifted. By 6 in the morning, Aliana stood and walked toward the front of the bus. Surveillance from the front exit camera showed her stepping off alone 2 stops before her school. The boy remained seated as the bus pulled away. Aliana disappeared from view, now just half a mile from school. Yet she never arrived. It is not yet a criminal matter at this point. This is still a missing person, but everybody is trying to get one step ahead of the situation. Detectives pulled footage from the exterior bus camera and tracked Aliana's movements after she stepped off. The video showed her walking in the direction of the bus route, moving along the sidewalk and crossing the street. Just as the bus drove out of frame, investigators caught one final glimpse of her standing at the corner of East 93rd and Kinsman, the spot where she would normally transfer to her second bus. The area was known for high crime rates and frequent homicides. It was a dangerous stretch for a young girl traveling alone. Detectives replayed the footage over and over, scrutinizing every person who appeared anywhere near her. That is when they noticed him. A man in a white coat, on the same bus, seated directly behind her the entire time. And as Aliana crossed the street at that corner, the man appeared to follow. Investigators began to consider him a person of interest and focused their attention on tracking his movements. But they still needed to know if Aliana had made it to her second bus. Footage from the second bus finally arrived at the station, and investigators scanned it with urgent attention. They confirmed that Aliana had boarded her usual transfer. The man in the white jacket did not appear on the second bus. With no further connection to Aliana, he was ruled out as a suspect. But the second recording revealed something deeply unsettling. Aliana did not ride to her normal stop near the school. Instead, she stepped off early, at the corner of East 93rd and Bessemer. Detectives questioned her family and friends, but no one could explain why she would have gotten off there. The boy from the first bus had insisted she planned to go straight to school. There was no reason for the detour. No one knew of any arrangement she might have had in that area. With no new answers, investigators shifted their focus to the neighborhood surrounding that second bus stop, and officers conducted a grid search, sweeping the streets block by block. Just 2 blocks from where she had stepped off the bus, a stretch of abandoned buildings stood in decay, their windows boarded, their interiors dark and forgotten. 2 uniformed officers entered a derelict house on Fuller Avenue, forcing themselves into pitch-black rooms with only their flashlights cutting through the darkness. A growing sense of dread followed them inside. You just have this sinking feeling in your stomach. As the officers moved deeper into the abandoned structure, their lights caught something on the floor. A trail of blood, crossing from one room into the next. They followed it, hearts pounding, and discovered scattered clothing, personal items, and several tools smeared with blood. They pressed further. And in a dim, boarded-up room at the back of the house, they found her. The scene was horrifying. Tools and objects that had caused the wounds lay nearby. The sheer amount of blood and violence made it one of the most disturbing crime scenes either officer had ever encountered. The victim was so severely injured that at first, her features were too damaged for a positive identification. Based on the clothing and the personal effects scattered around her, investigators believed with devastating certainty that it was Aliana. But they awaited official confirmation from the medical examiner before notifying the family. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and volunteers carried the news back to the family, who were still out searching the streets. Within their hearts, Aliana's parents already knew the truth before anyone said a word. The autopsy later confirmed what they feared most. The body belonged to 14-year-old Aliana DeFries. Her father struggled to accept a reality no parent should ever be forced to confront.
Somebody killed my daughter. I'm just telling myself somebody actually killed my freaking daughter. Well, I was enraged. Our precious, beautiful Aliana was no more.
At the crime scene, forensic investigators moved in with methodical precision. The body had been recovered. Now the work shifted entirely from finding Aliana to identifying her killer. The team photographed every inch of the scene, collecting DNA samples, blood evidence, fingerprints, and documenting every piece of physical material to be sent to the crime lab for analysis. Any one of those samples could point to a suspect. But detectives were not about to wait for lab results before they started moving. Officers were immediately deployed across the surrounding neighborhood, canvassing for witnesses and searching for anyone who might be responsible. Then a break came, in the form of surveillance cameras. Signs on a nearby building indicated video monitoring equipment in the area, and detectives identified a church positioned at the corner of Fuller and 93rd, with exterior cameras pointing directly toward the street where Aliana's body had been discovered. Copies of that footage were retrieved and rushed to the station. Investigators cued the church surveillance to approximately 6 in the morning, the time Aliana had stepped off her second bus at the wrong stop. They needed to determine if she had planned to meet someone in this area or if she had been followed. For several minutes, the grainy footage showed empty streets. Snow had begun to fall, softening the edges of everything in the frame. Then, at around 7 in the morning, a short figure appeared, walking down the sidewalk. Comparing the footage to the earlier bus recordings, detectives identified the figure as Aliana. Her distinctive backpack was visible even through the snowfall. As she neared the corner, a man appeared. Aliana hesitated. She stepped back. Whether it was something he said or some instinctive alarm firing in her chest, it was clear from the footage that this encounter was not planned. She had not come here to meet this person. It is so chilling watching that surveillance video because you just knew. You were like, oh man, this is about to be terrible. Detective zoomed in on the man, but heavy snowfall obscured his face. His brief interaction with Aliana appeared tense, suspicious. And then Aliana walked out of frame. Seconds later, the man followed. Investigators switched to a second camera overlooking a nearby parking lot. At the very top edge of the frame, they caught a glimpse of movement, Aliana's legs as she stepped into view. She reached the corner, the man approached her again, and then both figures slipped out of frame together, swallowed by the edge of the screen. At 7 in the morning, another camera picked them up further down Fuller Avenue. Despite the snow distorting the image, it was clear enough. 2 figures, moving together in the direction of the abandoned house where her body would later be discovered. The smaller silhouette walked ahead, while the larger figure hovered close behind, steering her forward. Moments later, they vanished off screen. That was the last known image of 14-year-old Aliana DeFries alive. And detectives knew with absolute certainty that they had just watched her abduction unfold in real time. Investigators then scrubbed back further through the earlier church footage, pulling up the timestamp from around 5 in the morning when the streets were still completely empty and the snow had not yet started to fall. What they found sent a chill through the entire investigative team. A man with a shaved head was seen slowly pacing the block. He drifted in and out of the camera's frame, circling the same stretch of sidewalk over and over, with no clear destination and no apparent purpose. He was not waiting for a bus. He was not heading anywhere. He was simply watching, waiting. Minutes before Aliana appeared on camera, he returned once more, pacing with the same cold patience, like someone waiting for prey. Police were convinced they were watching her killer, actively stalking the neighborhood for a victim. Reports began coming in from other women in the area who said they had been approached by a man matching the same description in recent weeks. Police feared they were dealing with a repeat offender, someone already known to the system, someone who had done this before. With no confirmed identity yet, detectives began pulling files, scanning through records of violent and repeat offenders, desperate to match a face to the blurry figure in the snow. Aliana's death had been vicious and deliberate. The man who had done this was still out there, and investigators knew with grim certainty that someone capable of this level of brutality would not simply stop. Not unless they stopped him first. Aliana's manner of death was grotesque and violent. Guys like that, they just belong in prison, and that is the only place for them to keep everybody else safe. As detectives closed in, the community gathered near the abandoned house on Fuller Avenue where Aliana had been found. Grief filled those frozen streets. Neighbors, volunteers, and strangers stood together in silence, struggling to comprehend how something like this could happen to a 14-year-old girl simply trying to get to school. For her parents, returning to that place was almost unbearable. The reality had settled in fully now. Her room would remain empty. Her laughter was gone. The future they had imagined for her, a high school graduation, a prom dress, a wedding day, had been stolen from them in a few brutal minutes on a cold Cleveland morning. Now it is accepting the fact that my daughter is not here. It is accepting the fact that that room will be empty. Her bed will not be slept in. I will not hear her laughing and all that good stuff. Back at the police department, the breakthrough investigators had been working toward finally arrived. They identified 44-year-old Christopher Whitaker, a registered sex offender with a documented history of violence. In 2005, he had been convicted of assaulting a woman and stabbing her in the neck. His arrest photograph matched the man who had been captured on the church camera, pacing outside in the pre-dawn darkness just before Aliana's abduction. Moments later, DNA results from the crime scene came back and confirmed the match beyond any doubt. Now with the video and the DNA, everything came together. The detectives realized that it was Christopher Whitaker they had seen pacing outside the church. Christopher Whitaker, who had approached Aliana on the street corner. And Christopher Whitaker, who had steered her down Fuller Avenue toward the house where her body was found. With Whitaker identified, the case was immediately handed over to the United States Marshals Northern Ohio Violent Fugitive Task Force, a specialized unit dedicated to tracking down the most dangerous criminals at large. This time, they knew they were hunting someone capable of extreme violence, and they moved accordingly. I wanted to personally see him go to jail for the horrendous acts that he committed on that girl. The Marshals moved fast. They headed straight to Whitaker's last known address, weapons ready, fully aware that a killer could be waiting on the other side of any door they knocked on. When the door finally swung open, they came face to face with a massive man towering in the frame, Christopher Whitaker. When officers finally moved in and restrained him, they were struck by his sheer physical presence. His wrists were unnaturally large, thick with muscle, and standard-issue handcuffs barely locked into place, clicking only a couple of times before tightening against his skin. In that moment, the contrast was impossible to shake. Here was a man of extraordinary size and strength, built for force, who had chosen as his victim a 14-year-old girl, slight and defenseless, simply trying to get to 7th grade. That image lingered in every investigator's mind long after the arrest was made. To them, it felt like they had laid hands on something far darker than a suspect, something monstrous. It sickens me to think of how big of a man this guy was, and how little she was, and what he did to her. Christopher Whitaker was transported to the homicide unit and taken into custody. The moment he was brought in for questioning, it was clear he understood the hunt was over. He attempted to distance himself from the crime, initially denying any involvement. But when detectives laid the DNA results on the table in front of him, and then walked him through the surveillance footage piece by piece, his resistance began to fracture. Slowly, reluctantly, he conceded details. He admitted to being at the scene. He admitted to handling the tools that had later been recovered inside the abandoned house. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no version of events in which he walked away from it. With enough evidence to secure a conviction, Christopher Whitaker was formally charged with aggravated murder. He entered a plea of not guilty, forcing every last detail of that January morning into the public record of a courtroom. At trial, prosecutors laid out the full timeline with devastating clarity. At 6 a.m. on January 26, 2017, 14-year-old Aliana DeFries boarded her first bus, wearing her blue headscarf, her black coat, and her school uniform. She transferred shortly after, continuing towards school just as she did every single day. But at approximately 6 a.m, she stepped off her second bus 2 stops too early. There was no explanation for it. The area was still dark, the streets quiet and cold. Investigators believed she may have been disoriented, perhaps drowsy in the early morning, perhaps momentarily confused about her stop. She stepped into a situation she never had a chance to understand. It was the worst possible moment. A confused young girl walked through a quiet neighborhood, unaware that a predator had been stalking those exact streets for over an hour, waiting for someone exactly like her. The abandoned houses are terrible for a neighborhood. They are a perfect place to take somebody if you are going to try and kidnap them. Whitaker, a large and physically imposing figure, approached Aliana on that street corner. For a child her size, his very presence would have been overwhelming. He led her toward one of those abandoned properties on Fuller Avenue. Inside, he tortured and murdered her. The brutality of what he did was so severe, so deliberately vicious, that Aliana's remains had to be identified through dental records. Her own parents had to use her dental records to confirm that the body found in that dark, boarded-up room was their daughter. It was just cruel. It was cruel and evil. There was no other word for it. The defense had no answer for the DNA evidence. No explanation for the surveillance footage that showed Whitaker pacing those streets before dawn, waiting. No alternative theory for the tools recovered at the scene. No story that could undo what the evidence had made undeniable. On February 13th, 2018, a jury found Christopher Whitaker guilty of the kidnapping and murder of 14-year-old Aliana DeFries. He was sentenced to death. A punishment many felt barely matched the cruelty of what he had done. Though he appealed the sentence, his guilt was never in question. The evidence had spoken clearly from the very beginning, from the moment those surveillance cameras captured his face, pacing that frozen sidewalk in the pre-dawn hours of a January morning, hunting for a child to destroy. For her father, time stopped in the worst possible way. In his memory, Aliana is frozen at 14 years old. Forever a bright girl on her way to school, forever that little girl who wanted to look like a princess for her dad at the school dance.
She's gonna be 14 in my mind forever. I don't know what a 21-year-old Ollie looks like. I don't know what a married Aliana looks like, but she wouldn't want us to be sad.
In her memory, her family founded an organization dedicated to protecting children who rely on public transportation, working to provide safe transit options and to clear the kinds of abandoned, decaying structures that had made Aliana's abduction possible in the first place. Through that work, through every child kept safer because of what happened to her, they turned an unspeakable tragedy into purpose, a warning and a mission, to ensure no other child disappears into the dark, unnoticed. Because as her family has said, plainly and without hesitation to every parent who will listen, do not ever think it cannot happen to you, because it can. You never know who is watching. Somebody can just take them just that fast, and you do not even know it. You will turn around and they will be gone. Aliana DeFries was 14 years old. She was on her way to school. She had a backpack on her back and a blue scarf wrapped around her head against the cold. She had said I love you to her stepmother 4 days before and promised to see her next weekend. She had a room waiting for her, a father who loved her with everything he had, a whole future stretching out ahead of her. And on a quiet, snow-covered street corner in Cleveland, Ohio, on an ordinary Thursday morning, all of it was taken from her in moments she never saw coming. The CCTV cameras captured her final steps. Investigators watched those recordings over and over in the desperate hours of the search, watching a little girl walk toward danger without knowing it, watching a predator close in from behind, watching the last known image of Aliana DeFries alive fade to static at the edge of a frame. Christopher Whitaker sits on death row today for what he did on Fuller Avenue that morning. The tools are gone, the abandoned house stands as a reminder of what lurks in neglected places, and somewhere in Cleveland, a family continues to carry a grief that never fully lifts. But Aliana's name is still spoken, her story is still told, and the organization built in her memory is still working, one child at a time, to make sure that no other family has to learn what hers learned on January 26, 2017. That the last CCTV image of their child alive is not the same as having them home